You're lying in bed at midnight, door shut, phone dark, completely alone with your own thoughts. 9,000 kilometers away, in a limestone cave in Morocco called Jebel Irhoud, sits a skull, roughly 300,000 years old. In 2017, a team led by paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin dated it, along with several others found at the same site, and pushed back the known origin of Homo sapiens by about 100,000 years in a single announcement. Your species is at least that old, possibly older. Here's the strange part. The exact feeling you're having right now, alone, unwatched, unheard, free to think whatever you want without anyone reading it off your face, has existed for a tiny, tiny sliver of that entire timeline. No locked door. No blackout curtains, no solo bedroom with your name taped to it. For almost the whole of human history, someone was always within arm's reach. Someone could always hear you breathing at night. Someone could always see your face change in the exact second you lied, or wanted something you weren't supposed to want, or felt something you hadn't figured out how to explain yet, not even to yourself. You built an entire life on the quiet assumption that privacy is basic, a right. Something you're simply owed for existing, the way you're owed air or gravity. Think about how many small, private transactions you've already run today without noticing them as transactions at all. A door closed for a phone call you didn't want overheard. A screen tilted away from a shoulder that leaned in too close. A face arranged into something neutral, on purpose, until you were somewhere safe enough to let it drop. Every one of those tiny maneuvers assumes a baseline you've never had to question, that there is, somewhere, a version of you nobody else gets to see. It isn't. It's an invention. Recent, specific, and considerably stranger than you'd guess. Its origin story runs through a Neolithic town with no front doors at all. A Kalahari camp where 30 people would notice if you vanished for 20 minutes. A medieval house where the bed, the fire, and the family's livestock all shared one smoky room. A Roman toilet built for 100 strangers sitting shoulder to shoulder, and a Boston lawsuit from the 1890s that started, of all things, with newspapers being nosy about a dinner party. Somewhere in that story is an answer to a question you've probably never thought to ask, mostly because the answer has always felt too obvious to need asking in the first place. Right now, tonight, you can shut a door and mean it. You can choose exactly who sees your face and who doesn't, hour by hour, room by room. According to U.S. Census Bureau data, something close to 29% of American households now consist of a single person living completely alone, the highest share in the country's recorded history, nearly triple the rate in 1960, when only 13% of households were solo. You can go an entire day without another human being watching you eat, sleep, cry, argue, or simply sit and think. Ancient humans could not do that. Not even close. Not for one full day. In most cases, not for one full hour. No door to close on a bad mood. No walk around the block to cool off, unobserved, before anyone saw your face again. No private grief, no private argument, no private version of falling in love, where the first clumsy weeks happened somewhere nobody else was watching. Whatever you're picturing when you picture alone time, it's not that ancient people had less of it than you. In the way you mean it, they largely didn't have it at all. Sit with that mismatch for a second, because it cuts against almost everything you've probably absorbed about human nature without meaning to. Somewhere along the way, you likely picked up the idea that people, left to their own devices, naturally drift toward independence, that solitude is the default state civilization interrupts, not the other way around. The evidence runs the opposite direction. For nearly all of human history, solitude wasn't the default anyone drifted toward. It was closer to an emergency. Something dangerous had usually gone wrong if a person ended up alone. So here's the actual question worth asking, the one hiding underneath the obvious one. Did ancient humans have anything you'd recognize as a private life at all? Or is private life something closer to indoor plumbing, a modern comfort so total, so seamlessly integrated into your existence that you've mistaken it for a basic human constant instead of what it actually is? It's worth sitting with how strange that question actually is once you say it out loud. You've probably never had to ask whether privacy is universal, the same way you've never had to ask whether other people can see color, or feel pain, or need sleep. It's simply assumed, baked so deeply into your expectations of a normal human life that its absence, if you ever encountered it, would feel less like a cultural difference and more like a violation. The honest answer turns out to be more interesting than a simple yes or no. Ancient humans had almost none of what you'd call physical privacy. No locked rooms, no solo bedrooms, no guaranteed hours of being unseen. And yet, the record left behind, archaeological, ethnographic, architectural, and eventually legal, suggests they built something else instead. Something that did a similar job, using completely different tools. Tools that had nothing to do with walls or doors at all. Understanding what that something was tells you less about them, honestly, and more about exactly what you traded away to get that locked door tonight. Start 9,000 years ago, on a dry, sun-baked plain in what's now central Turkey, at a place called Çatalhöyük. In 1993, British archaeologist Ian Hodder took over excavation of the site, launching a project that would run for the next 25 years and eventually turn Çatalhöyük into one of the most intensively studied Neolithic settlements anywhere on Earth. What his team uncovered, layer by layer, was a town of up to 8,000 people at its population peak, packed into a dense honeycomb of mud brick houses built wall to wall against one another, with population estimates across the site's roughly 14th century occupation ranging from 3,500 up to that 8,000 figure depending on the phase. No streets, no alleys, no gaps between one household and the next. Here's the detail that matters most. The houses had no doors at ground level. None whatsoever. You didn't walk into your home the way you walk into yours. You climbed onto the roof using an exterior ladder, then climbed down a second ladder through a hole cut directly into the ceiling, descending straight into the room where you cooked, slept, worked, made art, and, when a family member died, buried them beneath the exact floor you were currently standing on. Picture your commute home reimagined that way. No front door to unlock in a private, unobserved moment, out of anyone's line of sight, for even a few seconds of transition between the outside world and your own space. Every single entrance and exit happened on the roof, which functioned as the settlement's real street network, shared, communal, walked across by every neighbor, doing the exact same climb, at the exact same hour, in full view of everyone else. Hodder's team also found something that complicates the obvious assumption you'd make about a town built like this. You might guess that a settlement with no visible streets, no obvious hierarchy, and identical stacked housing was simply primitive, a place where nobody had gotten around to inventing architecture yet, or status, or anything resembling privilege. The data says otherwise, and says it with some precision. House sizes at Çatalhöyük stayed remarkably consistent across more than 1,000 years of continuous occupation. No palaces, no mansions, no slum district for the poor sitting beside a showcase district for the rich. Here's where it gets stranger, not less strange. Inside those shared, doorless rooms, residents weren't just eating and sleeping in full view of each other. They were also, apparently, making art nobody outside the household would ever formally exhibit, but everyone inside it saw constantly. Excavators have documented elaborate wall paintings and plastered reliefs, leopards, vultures, and bullheads mounted directly into the walls. Some rooms replastered dozens of times over the years. Fresh images painted over old ones in a space that functioned as bedroom, workshop, gallery, and cemetery all at once. There was no separate public building for that kind of expression. No gallery down the street you could visit and then leave. Whatever meaning those images held, you lived inside them, permanently, alongside everyone who shared your roof. Hodder eventually described the settlement's social structure using a specific, deliberate phrase: fierce egalitarianism. Isotopy analysis of human remains, a chemical technique that reveals what people actually ate, down to the ratios of specific elements absorbed into bone over a lifetime, found no significant difference in diet between men and women at the site, a detail Hodder has pointed to directly when discussing the settlement's apparent gender balance. More recent genetic work on burials under the house floors has even suggested the community organized itself along matrilineal lines, tracing descent through mothers rather than fathers. In the centuries before European Neolithic societies shifted the other direction. Whatever privacy meant at Çatalhöyük, it clearly wasn't stratified. Nobody got more of it because they were rich, or male, or important. There's a further layer to the burial practice worth sitting with. Archaeologists working the site have identified certain dwellings as what Hodder's team calls history houses, homes that were rebuilt on the exact same footprint, generation after generation, sometimes for well over 100 years, accumulating dozens of burials beneath the same floor. A household wasn't just the living people crowded inside it at any given moment. It was also, quietly, permanently, everyone who had ever slept there and died there, still present, a few inches beneath your sleeping mat. Privacy from the neighbors was one thing. There wasn't much privacy from the dead, either. The rooftops themselves, meanwhile, weren't just a transit corridor you crossed grimly on your way somewhere else. Excavated evidence suggests they functioned as genuine social space, somewhere to work, to sit, to talk, arguably to watch your neighbors doing the exact same thing a few feet away. Çatalhöyük was occupied for roughly 14 centuries before it was gradually abandoned, and researchers still don't have a fully settled explanation for why. What they do have is UNESCO's 2012 decision to name the site a World Heritage Location, in recognition of just how rare and complete a picture it offers of what dense, wall-to-wall, door-free communal living actually looked like day to day, for thousands of people at once. Which raises an obvious, uncomfortable question. How do you have any inner life at all when your neighbor isn't just close by, but structurally on top of you, sharing a wall, sharing a roofline, entering their home through the exact same kind of hole in the ceiling as you enter yours? And when even the dead haven't fully left the room? So what did people actually do, generation after generation, with no walls to hide behind and no doors to shut? The next stop isn't another excavation. It's a living, breathing example. Because for a stretch of the 20th century, anthropologists had a genuinely rare opportunity to study communities still living something close to the way humans lived for the overwhelming majority of their existence on this planet. Full-time, mobile, foraging bands with no agriculture, no permanent architecture, and no walls of any kind. Starting in 1963, Canadian anthropologist Richard Lee began a long-term study of the Jew/hoansi, a San-speaking foraging people of the Kalahari Desert, centered on a waterhole area that came to be called Dobe, spanning territory in what's now Botswana and Namibia. Lee's research, published across decades and eventually distilled into the widely used textbook The Dobe Jew/hoansi, first released in 1979 and updated through multiple editions since, remains one of the most thoroughly documented accounts of hunter-gatherer life ever produced by a single researcher. In 1966, Lee and fellow anthropologist Irvin DeVore co-organized the Man the Hunter Symposium at the University of Chicago, a gathering that helped establish hunter-gatherer studies as a serious academic field in its own right. Here's the number that matters. A typical Jew/hoansi camp in Lee's data held somewhere around 30 people, sometimes fewer, occasionally more, living in close, semi-permanent clusters of simple grass shelters arranged in a loose circle facing inward toward a shared central space. The distance between one family's shelter and the next was often just a handful of meters, close enough to hear a private conversation, close enough that a raised voice or a deliberately lowered one traveled the length of the entire camp within seconds. The shelters themselves offered essentially no acoustic privacy at all, even by the standards of a Çatalhöyük roof hole or a medieval hall. Built quickly from bent branches and thatched grass, designed to be abandoned and rebuilt every few weeks as the group moved to follow water and food, they were about keeping off wind, sun, and rain, not about keeping in sound, or keeping out a neighbor's gaze. A cough, a whisper, a private argument between partners, all of it traveled easily across a camp where the nearest family was sometimes close enough to reach out and touch. In a group that size, disappearing simply isn't an option. Someone always knows roughly where you are. Someone always notices if you're gone and starts asking why within the hour. There is no working version of "I need some space" that doesn't get immediately clocked by an entire community of people who have, in most cases, known you since the day you were born. And yet, this is where the story gets genuinely interesting. The Jew/hoansi weren't a people without any form of discretion at all. They built something in place of walls. Lee's most cited essay on the subject, Eating Christmas in the Kalahari, documents a specific, deliberate cultural practice, aggressive, ritualized humility, especially around hunting success. A hunter who brought down a large, valuable animal was expected to talk about the kill as though it were nearly worthless, a scrawny, bony, hardly worth the effort catch, even when it was about to feed the entire camp for days. Lee learned this the hard way, and documented his own embarrassment as part of the record. He bought a large ox as a holiday gift for the community he'd been living with, expecting straightforward gratitude, and was instead mocked mercilessly by the very people he'd fed, mocked for the animal's supposed skinniness, its supposed poor quality, right up until it was slaughtered and turned out to be enormous, more than enough meat for everyone. The mockery, he eventually came to understand, wasn't cruelty and wasn't really about the ox at all. It was a mechanism, a deliberate, culturally enforced way of preventing pride, envy, and hierarchy from taking root inside a group that had no physical way to escape one another, ever. For an entire lifetime. The most vulnerable, unguarded hours of the day back this up in a completely different way. Anthropologist Carol Worthman of Emory University has spent much of her career building what didn't previously exist in her field, a cross-cultural, quantitative study of how people actually sleep, rather than assuming sleep is a fixed biological constant everywhere on Earth. Her research across traditional societies, including foraging groups like the Jew/hoansi and Efe, found that solitary sleep, one person, alone, no one else in the room or on the same mat, accounted for roughly 1/5 of recorded sleep events. The overwhelming majority involved co-sleeping, sharing a sleeping space with a partner, a child, a sibling, sometimes several people at once, on skins spread over sand or simple woven mats, with no walls and often no roof at all beyond open sky. The most defenseless hours of a human life, unconscious, unguarded, unable to monitor your own face or posture, were, for nearly the entirety of human history, also the least private. You didn't just live with an audience. You slept in front of one, every single night for your entire life, and it barely registered as a fact worth remarking on. Everyone assumes that a society with no private rooms must simply be a society with no privacy at all, full transparency by default. Nothing to hide because there's nowhere to hide it. The Jew hoansi case suggests something close to the opposite. When you physically cannot build a wall, you build the emotional equivalent of one instead. Performance, understatement, ritual self-deprecation, and social camouflage, all doing roughly the same job a locked door does for you tonight. So if you couldn't hide your body, you learned to hide your pride instead, and your resentment, and your grief, filtered carefully through decades of shared etiquette designed for a life with zero physical escape. What happens then when you fast forward 10,000 years out of the desert entirely and into a cold European farmhouse? Jump forward into medieval Europe, and the picture doesn't actually improve much. It just changes shape entirely. Author and researcher Bill Bryson spent years reconstructing the ordinary domestic history of the West for his 2010 book, At Home, A Short History of Private Life, working his way room by room through an actual former Victorian rectory in England to trace where each part of a modern house originally came from. What he found, tracing the history further back, was that for most of the medieval period, a house for an ordinary family meant one single room, called the hall, and the hall wasn't part of the house. It was, quite literally, the entire building, start to finish. There was no upstairs. There couldn't be one yet. The reason is almost embarrassingly simple. Chimneys, in any common household form, hadn't been invented. Families heated the hall with an open hearth fire, built directly on the floor, dead center of the room, and the smoke found its own way out, through gaps in the roof, through the thatch, through whatever crack happened to be available that day. Bryson describes the arrangement, in his own words during an NPR interview promoting the book, as something close to keeping a permanent bonfire burning in the middle of your living room every single day for your entire life. That one room did everything a house needs to do. People cooked there, they ate there, they slept there, the whole family together, on the floor or on simple straw pallets, frequently within a few feet of servants, and in many households. Alongside the family's own animals as well, brought inside overnight for warmth, safety, and shared body heat. Historian Peter Laslett, in his landmark study The World We Have Lost, first published in 1965 and revised across later editions, makes the underlying point directly. Cold climate households had no real option except to huddle around one fire and share sleeping space, which meant something you'd now call indispensable, almost as a human right, was, for most of history, simply unavailable. One space. One fire, one roof over everyone and everything you owned, all of you breathing the same smoke, hearing the same sounds, watching one another do every single thing a human being does across a day and a night, with nowhere to look away to. Then, roughly in the 14th century, one specific invention changed the entire trajectory of Western domestic life: the chimney. Once smoke could finally be channeled up and out through a proper flue, instead of simply filling the room and drifting out through the roof however it could. The space above the hall, previously unusable, thick with soot, heat, and grime, became livable for the very first time. Builders started adding a second floor, and the moment that second floor existed, something even more consequential became structurally possible: separate rooms with actual doors that some people had access to and others didn't. This is worth sitting with, because it's easy to skim past. The private bedroom, the specific, deeply modern idea of a room that's yours, where you sleep apart from the rest of your household, where you can physically close a door on everyone else in your life for a few hours, is not an ancient human tradition stretching back into the deep past. It's a side effect of chimney engineering. Privacy, in a very real architectural sense, is downstream of better ventilation, and downstream of nothing more romantic than smoke management. And even once that upstairs finally existed, it didn't arrive for everyone at once. It arrived first, and for a long time only, for whoever owned the house. In wealthier, medieval, and early Tudor households, the lord and his family gradually withdrew upward into private chambers, while the hall below stayed exactly what it had always been: one shared room where servants, retainers, and hangers-on continued eating, working, and sleeping together, much as they always had. Privacy didn't spread evenly through a household the way the fire once had. It stacked itself vertically, floor by floor, with the people who already had the least power ending up furthest from a door of their own. Even after that shift, old habits lingered for centuries longer than you'd expect. Well into the early modern period, travelers at roadside inns across Europe routinely shared not just rooms, but entire beds with total strangers. Simply because that was what the available space allowed, and nobody involved considered it especially remarkable. Laslet's research into pre-industrial English households also found something else that cuts against a common assumption: extended, multi-generational families crowded under one roof were the exception, not the rule. Most households were small and nuclear, but small didn't mean private. It meant fewer people sharing the same single unpartitioned room, not more rooms to spread out into. Everyone assumes that if a family wanted privacy badly enough, across enough generations, they'd eventually have found some way to build it, that the desire alone should have been sufficient. What the historical record actually shows runs closer to the reverse. The desire may well have existed the entire time, quietly, largely unspoken, simply because there was no vocabulary yet for wanting something that didn't exist. But it took one specific, unglamorous piece of engineering, invented for an entirely different reason, to make that desire physically achievable at all. So walls came late, doors came even later. But here's a stranger twist buried inside the same story. Even once people finally had walls, they didn't necessarily get privacy in anything like the sense you'd assume. Cross the Mediterranean and go back further in time to ancient Rome, and you find a civilization that was, in some ways, more architecturally sophisticated about privacy than medieval Europe would be more than 1,000 years later, and in other ways, spectacularly indifferent to it, in precisely the place you'd least expect that indifference to show up. Classical archaeologist Anne Olga Koloski-Ostro spent years studying the physical remains of Roman sanitation infrastructure, publishing her findings in the 2015 book, The Archaeology of Sanitation, in Roman Italy, toilets, sewers, and water systems. Her research focused heavily on the Vesuvian region, Pompeii and its neighboring towns, preserved in devastating, extraordinary detail by the eruption of 79C, along with the well-preserved port city of Ostia, where physical evidence of daily infrastructure survives in unusually good condition. Here's the number that should stop you cold. Roman public latrines, known as foracae, were often built as long stone or marble benches with rows of keyhole-shaped openings cut directly into the seating surface, accommodating dozens of people at once, side by side, at the exact same time, with zero partitions between them anywhere. Some installations, like the ones connected to the baths of Caracalla, could seat around 100 people simultaneously. No stalls, no doors, no divider walls of any kind anywhere in the room. Just a long communal bench, a channel of flowing water underneath carrying everything away, and whoever else happened to be sitting there that afternoon. Modern instinct says this arrangement must mean Romans simply didn't care about bodily privacy, that shame around the body as a functioning social concept hadn't been invented yet either, and wouldn't be for centuries. Koloski-Ostro's research pushes back directly on that exact assumption. Her work highlights a detail you genuinely never think to consider on your own: the concealing nature of Roman clothing itself. Heavy draped togas and tunics that could fall around a seated person almost like a curtain, combined with the deliberately dim, unlit interior of most latrine buildings, and even the physical design of the openings, positioned in a way that allowed a real measure of physical modesty despite the total absence of walls or stalls. There's a further wrinkle here that complicates things even more. Some later scholars examining Koloski-Ostro's work have pointed out that the physical evidence alone can't actually prove these long benches were used simultaneously by crowds at all. The size may simply reflect peak demand across a full day, seat after seat used one at a time, rather than proof of some casual, chatty, shoulder-to-shoulder Roman toilet culture. The popular image of Romans cheerfully gossiping side by side while relieving themselves may itself be a modern exaggeration, built more on the shape of the architecture than on any actual written account of how people behaved inside it. Either way, the deeper point holds. Everyone assumes communal toilets with no partitions are automatic proof that an entire culture had no working concept of privacy whatsoever. The archaeology, read carefully, says something more precise and considerably more interesting. The Romans built privacy into fabric, into lighting, into posture and social convention, instead of building it into architecture. It's a completely different toolkit, aimed at more or less the exact same goal your bathroom door quietly serves for you every single day. Meanwhile, privacy for wealthier Romans took a completely different, more architectural shape inside the home itself. The Roman domus, the private townhouse of a well-off family, was deliberately organized into public and private zones. A formal atrium near the entrance for greeting clients and conducting business, gradually giving way to more secluded rooms deeper inside the house, reserved for family life. But that architectural privacy was a luxury tied directly to wealth, unlike the rough egalitarian sameness of Çatalhöyük thousands of years earlier. Slaves and servants inside those same wealthy households, meanwhile, often had no private space at all, sleeping wherever there was room, on call at essentially any hour. It wasn't only the toilets, either. The famous Roman bathhouses, vast, architecturally ambitious public buildings, some of them, like the baths of Caracalla, covering dozens of acres, were built around the same basic assumption. Bathing was a communal, unclothed, thoroughly social activity, not a private one. People soaked, scraped, gossiped, and conducted business together in shared pools, on a daily basis, as a matter of ordinary civic life, not an exception to some deeper norm of privacy that only broke down in the toilet block. The Roman body, in public infrastructure terms, was simply not treated as something that needed to be hidden away by default. Step outside that one privileged household, into the ordinary Roman street, and the picture flips again. Most residents of Rome and its port cities didn't live in a domus at all. They lived stacked into multi-story apartment blocks called insulae, cramped. Often flimsy tenement buildings, packed tightly along narrow streets, with entire families sharing one or two small rooms and thin walls, doing very little to stop sound, smoke, or smell from traveling freely between neighbors. Privacy in Rome, in other words, wasn't absent so much as it was rationed, allocated by class in exactly the same way almost everything else in Roman society was, from citizenship to clean water to a seat at the baths. Here's what all of this adds up to. Walking across 9,000 years and 3 continents in a single afternoon. Every era you've just moved through, Neolithic Turkey, the Kalahari, medieval Europe, Imperial Rome, solved the privacy problem using whatever tools happened to be available to them, centuries or millennia, before anyone framed privacy as something you could formally claim, or lose, or actually sue somebody over in a court of law. That legal framing, the version of privacy you genuinely recognize by name today, turns out to be astonishingly recent, and it didn't emerge from some grand, ancient philosophical tradition at all. It emerged from a very specific, fairly petty grievance in 1890s Boston. In December of 1890, the Harvard Law Review published an essay titled The Right to Privacy, written by 2 young lawyers, Samuel D. Warren and Louis D. Brandeis, the same Brandeis who would go on, decades later, to sit on the United States Supreme Court. The essay ran in Volume 4, Issue 5, spanning pages 193 through 220, and legal scholars today widely regard it as the founding document of American privacy law. The first serious, sustained legal argument that a person has a right to be let alone, entirely independent of property damage or physical injury. For most of the 20th century, the popular version of the article's origin story, repeated in law schools for decades, treated as settled fact, claimed Warren was personally furious about newspaper coverage of his daughter's wedding. It's a great story. It's also false, and legal historians eventually pointed out the obvious problem. Warren's daughter was only around 6 years old when the article was published, which makes a wedding scandal chronologically impossible on its face. The actual trigger, as later research eventually uncovered, was less romantic and, in its way, considerably more revealing. Warren's wife, Mabel, was a prominent Boston socialite from a well-connected political family, and Boston newspapers, particularly the Saturday Evening Gazette, which specialized in exactly this kind of coverage, had taken to reporting on her private social gatherings in, according to one legal account of the episode, highly personal and embarrassing detail. New technology made the whole situation worse, and made it worse quickly. Handheld Kodak cameras, first sold commercially only a few years earlier, meant photographs could now be taken instantly, in public, without a subject's knowledge or consent, and reproduced cheaply across the era's booming tabloid press almost overnight. The wider culture around Warren and Brandeis was, at the exact same moment, having a small, nationwide panic about this exact new capability. Popular journalism of the era coined a specific term of contempt for amateur photographers who carried their new handheld cameras everywhere, snapping candid pictures of strangers without asking. The Kodak fiend. In Britain, a group calling itself the Vigilance Association reportedly organized specifically to confront men photographing women at the seaside without consent. In the United States, one contemporary account describes a group of women on a train physically trying to smash a stranger's camera, then dumping a handful of sand over the offending photographer for good measure. People felt exposed by a technology that could capture them instantly, permanently, without their permission, and reacted, more than a century before your own phone camera anxieties, with genuine public anger. Warren and Brandeis simply gave that free-floating anxiety a legal argument to attach itself to. Everyone assumes the modern idea of privacy, the actual legal right you rely on today, whether you've ever thought about it or not, grew slowly and philosophically out of some dignified centuries-long intellectual tradition. The truth is messier and considerably more human. It was essentially invented, almost overnight, by two annoyed lawyers responding to gossip columns and a new camera technology that felt, to them personally, like a genuine invasion. That argument didn't stay confined to a law review. In 1928, by then a sitting Supreme Court justice, Brandeis reused his own 38-year-old argument in a famous dissent in Olmsted v. United States, describing the right to be let alone as, in his words, the most comprehensive of rights and the one most valued by civilized people. Nearly 4 decades after that, in 1965, the Supreme Court's majority in Griswold v. Connecticut finally recognized a constitutional zone of privacy, building directly on the intellectual line Warren and Brandeis had started with an essay about gossip columns and a new camera. Privacy law, in other words, was a direct reaction to one specific new capability: instant, unauthorized image capture deployed by strangers without consent, which happens to be the exact same basic anxiety still driving most privacy arguments you'll encounter online today, roughly a century and a half later, aimed at very different cameras. It's a strange thing to realize that the legal foundation underneath your modern expectation of privacy, the reason a stranger generally can't legally photograph you through your own bedroom window and publish it, the reason courts still lean on that same century-old language about being let alone, traces back to two lawyers annoyed about a society column. Not a war, not a revolution, not a grand constitutional convention, a newspaper being rude about a dinner party, and two men with law degrees deciding, essentially on the spot, that the law simply hadn't caught up yet. This is where all 5 of these stories actually converge, and it isn't quite where you'd expect them to land. Every era you've just walked through had dramatically less privacy than you have right now, by an almost incomprehensible margin, and yet none of them read, in the historical or ethnographic record, as more starved for inner life than you are tonight. Çatalhöyük's residents painted elaborate murals inside homes that thousands of neighbors could technically climb into. The hoansi built rich, complicated systems of humor, obligation, and social nuance inside camps, where nobody had ever once slept out of earshot of anyone else. Medieval families built entire relationships, entire disagreements, entire quiet private moments inside a single smoky room shared with servants and livestock. Romans built modesty out of draped fabric and dim lighting instead of stone walls. What none of these societies had was solitude on demand. What all of them had instead was something closer to permanent, low-grade witness. The constant background awareness that another person could see you, essentially at all times, for your entire life. And the evidence increasingly suggests that constant witness wasn't simply tolerated, gritted through, endured, it was regulating. It kept hunters humble in the Kalahari. It kept a Neolithic town of thousands remarkably equal for well over 1,000 years running. It's arguably what an entire medieval household of near strangers, sleeping a few feet apart, relied on instead of locks that didn't yet exist. You got the opposite trade, and you got it astonishingly fast, historically speaking. You got the locked door, the solo bedroom, the blackout curtains, the phone you can check without a single other person watching your face while you do it. And in May of 2023, the United States Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, released a formal public health advisory declaring something the country had never needed to formally declare before in its history: an epidemic of loneliness and isolation. The report found that roughly half of American adults were already experiencing measurable loneliness before the pandemic even began, and it stated, plainly and without much hedging, that the associated health risk was comparable to smoking as many as 15 cigarettes a day, every single day. That's not a coincidence sitting quietly beside everything you just heard. That's the other half of the trade, arriving on schedule. For roughly 300,000 years, your species built its entire social and emotional architecture around almost never being alone, around a baseline level of visibility to other people that, by today's standards, would feel genuinely suffocating within about an hour. And it worked, more or less, for the overwhelming majority of human history, right up until an extremely recent, extremely narrow sliver of time. There's a strange irony sitting underneath all of this that's worth naming directly. You spent the last century building thicker walls, quieter bedrooms, and stronger locks specifically to get away from other people's eyes. And then you voluntarily filled that private, hard-won room with a device that watches you back. The same instinct the Jew hoansi managed with mockery and modesty, the instinct Romans managed with draped fabric. The instinct an entire Boston law firm turned into a legal doctrine over a nosy newspaper is still running. It just no longer has a village to negotiate with. It has a feed, an algorithm, and no equivalent of a hunter get mocked back down to size by people who love him. Ancient privacy, such as it was, always came bundled with something else. Witnesses who also, on the whole, wished you well. Neighbors, campmates, servants. A household that annoyed you and also, in the same breath, would have noticed within the hour if something was actually wrong. Modern privacy severed those two things from each other. You got to keep the solitude. The built-in witnesses who cared what happened to you did not automatically come along for the ride. Run the whole timeline back through your head once more. Quickly, a roof hole in Turkey that made your entrance and exit a public event. A camp of 30 people in the Kalahari who would mock you back down to size the moment you got too proud. A single smoky room in medieval England where you fell asleep to the sound of your entire family's breathing, human and animal both. A Roman bench with no partitions, where modesty lived in the folds of your clothing instead of in a locked stall. A Boston law office where two irritated lawyers turned a new camera and a nosy newspaper into a legal doctrine that, eventually, an entire country would build its bedrooms, blinds, and browser tabs around. Different tools, different centuries, different continents, solving, again and again, some version of the exact same problem you now solve automatically, without thinking, every time you close a door. Then, in something close to a historical instant, measured against those 300,000 years. A chimney here, a shifting ethic of individualism there, a legal argument in an 1890 law review, a lock finally installed on an ordinary bedroom door sometime in the last century or two. You got exactly what you would have said if anyone had ever asked you that you wanted. Privacy, total, on-demand, structurally guaranteed solitude, available to you right now, tonight. Behind a door nobody else on Earth has a key to. And the data, gathered patiently over the last several years, increasingly suggests you're not entirely sure what to do with it now that you have it. So go back to that bedroom. Midnight, door shut. Phone dark. You, completely alone with your own thoughts, in a way that Skull from Jebel Irhoud, 300,000 years old, one of the earliest known members of your entire species, most likely never once experienced across an entire lifetime. Think about everyone who had to exist first, and everything that had to be invented first, purely to get you to this exact moment. Someone had to figure out that smoke could be sent up a shaft instead of just filling a room. Someone had to get annoyed enough at a newspaper to write an essay 2 law students would still be citing well over a century later. Someone had to decide that a door, on its own, could carry the entire moral weight of a boundary, that a piece of wood on a hinge could mean. Without needing to be said out loud, you may not come in here right now. None of that was inevitable. All of it could easily have gone differently, and for most of human history, it did. That person probably never had a single guaranteed hour of true solitude, never had a door to shut on purpose, never had a private thought that stayed entirely private, unread by anyone else's eyes, even for a moment. And by every scrap of evidence anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians have carefully gathered since, that absence wasn't the tragedy of their existence. It was, in its own strange way, part of the structure holding their whole world together. The humility, the equality, the closeness that never let anyone drift too far from anyone else. None of this is an argument for going back. Nobody sitting in a smoke-filled medieval hall, sleeping 4 feet from a stranger and a cow, was living some secretly superior life you should feel nostalgic for. The infant mortality was brutal. The lack of choice, especially for women, servants, and anyone born poor, was often closer to a life sentence than a lifestyle. Privacy, for all the loneliness now stapled to it, also came bundled with autonomy. The ability to think a thought, make a decision, or live a life your entire camp didn't get a vote on. That part of the trade was, by any honest measure, worth making. But it's worth noticing what quietly rode along with it, uninvited. You didn't just trade communal sleeping mats for a mattress with your name on it. You traded a permanent low-grade witness, nosy, occasionally exhausting, but reliably present, for the specific modern experience of being able to disappear so completely that statistically tens of millions of people now do it every single night, alone, and nobody notices for days if something goes wrong. You have the door now. You have the silence, the dark room, the guaranteed hours of being unseen. You have the exact privacy it took roughly 300,000 years, one accidental chimney, one new camera, and one very annoyed Boston lawyer to finally fully build. You didn't earn privacy. You could finally afford it. And it's taken less than a century to learn that being unwatched and being unseen were never the same thing at all.